Alas, Tracy had a bad reaction to a monthly infusion that she's having to keep cancer from biting her. So I'm going to pinch hit for her this morning. My name is Gail Johnson Vaughn. I'm going to be reading everything. So turn off your phones, please. Doesn't look like we need to crowd in the center because everybody's out having lunch, breakfast with their mothers and enjoying the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful weather. But before I get any further, can I have a large hip hip hooray for the mine? And all of you who worked so hard on that, and special kudos to Jim, who one of the supervisors said, I got so many calls from Jim Bear, one of the commissioners. There you go, there you go. So hooray for that, hooray for that. So I think we can just go ahead. So every week we talk about being in right relations with the Nisenan. And so we acknowledge that this land was their land, technically is their land. It was never ceded. And we talk about being in right relations, and I want to think about what that means. What does it mean to be in right relations? It means to remember, to feel some humility about the fact that we are in this space. And just because it happened generations before us, that we still have a responsibility. So that's so important. And every week we place this little basket of black oak acorns, which was a staple of them in those days, just to be a symbol of our commitment and appreciation for this land that we visit, live on, share. And so now with that, as you are willing and able, to rise in body and our spirit and sing our first song, Bright Morning Stars.
I am the Reverend Janet Ani, the sabbatical minister holding the place of Reverend Kevin Tarsa for this Unitarian Universalist community of the mountains in Grass Valley, California. Whoever you are, whatever your skin color, whatever your gender identification or sexual preference, whatever your cultural identity, economic status, physical or mental abilities, or any other identity that has kept you from revealing your whole self, you are welcome to make a home in this time and this space. In solidarity with the indigenous peoples across the United States, I acknowledge the land on which I make my home is the home of the Monacan Indian Nation, one of the few Native American groups still residing in their ancestral homeland of 10,000 years. They are recognized as one of the 7 indigenous tribes in the state of Virginia. This morning's service examines a piece of Unitarian Universalist history, particularly relevant to the celebration of Mother's Day. The Iowa Sisterhood gives witness to the fact that the birthing and nurturing of ideas and ideals is a valid expression of motherhood, even as that role is embraced by those identifying as male. We'll hear the stories of the women-led Bread and Roses strike of 1912 and the work of the women ministers 20 years earlier in the middle of this new nation, an area where the Unitarian and Universalist male ministers who attempted service in the Great Plains were found wanting. I can't help but think these 2 events, whose expressions of equity and fairness were birthed only 30 years apart, are influenced by the same impulses toward freedom of expression, regardless of gender. Today, we acknowledge the creativity involved in imagining and then enacting a world where equality is a dream realized. We light this chalice for mothers and mothering to celebrate those who have taken on the task of nurturing a young one, baby, child, or a youth, nurturing that young one into adulthood. To celebrate those who have nourished the light of truth and compassion in growing minds and hearts. To celebrate those who have committed time, energy, and money to the growth of others in this world. We light this chalice to celebrate and hold dear this flame of love. The slogan, Bread and Roses, originated in a poem by that name by James Oppenheim, published in the American Magazine in December 1911, which attributed it to the women of the West. It is commonly associated with the textile strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts during January through March 1912, now often known as the Bread and Roses strike. Here's the story. The power looms that thundered inside the cotton weaving room of the Everett Mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts, suddenly felt silent on January 11th, 1912. When a mill official demanded to know why workers were standing motionless next to their machines, the explanation was simple: not enough pay. The workers, who had opened their pay envelopes that afternoon, discovered that their weekly wages had been reduced by 32 cents. A newly enacted Massachusetts law had reduced the work week of women and children from 56 to 54 hours. But mill owners, unlike in the past, cut workers' wages proportionally. For workers who only averaged $8.76 per week, every penny was precious, and 32 cents made the difference between eating a meal or going hungry. Word of the strike by the women of the Everett Mill swept through Lawrence's squalid tenements that night, And the following morning, the walkout cascaded through the neighboring mills. By the end of January 12th, more than 10,000 workers were out on strike. Women didn't shy away from the protests. They delivered fiery rally speeches and marched in picket lines and parades. The banners they carried demanding both living wages and dignity. We want bread and roses too. That gave the work stoppage its name, the Bread and Roses Strike. As mill owners and city leaders violently pushed back, the city became increasingly unsafe. On February 10th, striking families sent 119 of their children out of harm's way to Manhattan to live with relatives or, in some cases, complete strangers who could provide food and a safe shelter. A cheering crowd of 5,000 greeted the children at Grand Central Terminal, and after a second train load arrived from Lawrence the following week, the children paraded down Fifth Avenue. The children's exodus proved to be a publicity coup for the strikers, and Lawrence authorities intended to halt it. When families brought another 46 children bound for Philadelphia to the city's train station on February 24th, the city marshal ordered them to disperse. When defiant mothers still tried to get their children aboard the train and they resisted authorities, police dragged them by their hair, beat them with clubs, and arrested them as their horrified children looked on in tears. The national reaction was visceral and marked a turning point in the Bread and Roses strike. President Taft asked his attorney general to investigate, and Congress began a hearing on the strike on March 2nd. Striking workers, including children who dropped out of school at age 14 or younger to work in the factories, described the brutal working conditions and the poor pay inside the Lawrence mills. 14-year-old Carmela Tioli shocked lawmakers by recounting how a mill machine had torn off her scalp and left her hospitalized for 7 months. After the children's testimony, the public tide turned in favor of the strikers for good. The mill owners were ready for a deal and agreed to many of the workers' demands. The two sides agreed to a 15% wage hike, a bump in overtime compensation, and a promise not to retaliate against the strikers. On March 14th, the 9-week strike ended as 15,000 workers gathered on Lawrence Common to shout their agreement to accept the offer. This was not just a victory for Lawrence workers. By the end of March, 275,000 New England textile workers received similar wages, and other industries followed suit. The Bread and Roses strike.
If there are any kids. Any of you who want to go to Kids Connection can go. As Carol comes up to join me in our weekly ritual, a time when we can carry in our hearts the joys and sorrows we are experiencing, coming forward and taking a stone, holding it and infusing it with all that we feel. The joy over the mine is the one thing that we have. The joy over the incredibly beautiful weather at last is another, and many, many others. And joys and sorrows around motherhood, all of these many things come with us as we come here, and we can share with each other. The stones drop the ripple of the joy and sorrow that goes out and touches all of us. So now, as you are ready and interested, please come forward, choose a stone, and add it to our pool of caring. Carol, who's a member of our lay pastoral care team, has added stones for those joys and sorrows that we hold in our hearts, and some of her own.
As we join hearts in the spirit of meditation and prayer, we reflect in thanksgiving this day for all those whose lives have nurtured ours. The life-giving ones who heal with their presence, who listen in sympathy, who give wise advice, but only when asked for it. We are grateful for all those who have mothered us, who have held us gently in times of sorrow, who celebrated with us in our triumphs, no matter how small, who noticed when we changed and grew, who praised us for taking risks, who took genuine pride in our success, and who expressed genuine compassion when we did not succeed. On this day that honors mothers, let us honor all mothers, regardless of gender identity, who from somewhere in their being have freely and wholeheartedly given life and sustenance and vision to us. Dear God, parent of us all, grant us life-giving ways, strength for birthing, and a nurturing spirit, that we may take attentive care of our world, our communities, and those precious beings entrusted to us by biology, or by destiny, or by friendship, fellowship, or fate. Give us the heart of the mother today. And now let us enter into the silence as a single breath and one beating heart.
As we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 workshops gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses.
Mother's Day is complicated. Joyful for many, yes, but complicated. It's right there on the calendar, even if your mother has died. Even if you've been told, yet again, that you're still not pregnant. Or if you've never been more scared than you are right now because you are pregnant. It's Mother's Day. Even if your own mother's priorities included everything but you, there's going to be a Mother's Day Google Doodle with flowers and pink stuff. Even if you have scars, ones you can see or ones you can't, it's Mother's Day. That cake mix commercial is going to roll out 4 times an hour, even when you can't stop shaking and crying because you can't believe you slapped your little boy today. It's Mother's Day. And we all have to live with that in those silent, breathless moments, because even when the baby dies, it's Mother's Day. So let's go to church. Let's be in a place in this time, in this space, where we can acknowledge how difficult it is to have this day, right alongside how joyful this day can be. Let's be real with each other, where we don't pretend there aren't any inky depths of space between us, even when we sing. Let's be a community that fills the space between our differences with love. Because even in the most broken places, there is room for love. We know we can be that church, and sometimes we even are. Today is the day many of my colleagues flee their pulpits, for good reason. This day started out innocently enough to raise the status of people who birth and nurture life. Mother's Day is now a unidimensional Hallmark holiday of cards, gifts, flowers, and restaurant meals. It's the single dimension that bothers me. The reality is that there are many mothers who fit the profile praised in the greeting cards. But there are just as many mothers who haven't been quite so wonderful. Some of them have been downright awful, and their children have anything but fond memories of them. Furthermore, some of our mothers are men. My husband is a far better nurturer than I am. In gay and lesbian and trans households, gender isn't a factor in the role of mothering. Delivering a message on this complicated relationship called motherhood is a minefield. So I decided to focus on the people who nurture, who birth or foster an idea and nurture it into its fullness. People who bend the arc toward a more just world. We heard about the women involved in the textile strike. About the same time, Julia Ward Howe and Ann Jarvis were campaigning to make a Mother's Day of Peace a national holiday. A group of women were preoccupied with birthing and nurturing Midwestern churches. We don't hear much about these women of the 1880s and 90s because it was not so long ago that our only accounts of recent church history were preoccupied with male personnel and their perspective. But revisionist scholarship has established that these women, the ministers' wives, missionaries, deaconesses, and all-round lay workers, were actually doing what ministers did without the recognition or the salary. The women I'm about to sketch out for you did achieve the title and office of minister. Their story, the story of the Iowa Sisterhood, may be familiar to some of you, but I think it bears repeating. Let's start with the lesser known story of the Sisterhood. Some of the first women ordained in the United States in the mid-1800s were Universalists or Unitarians. These women allied themselves with the radical wing of the liberal religion called rational Christians, or liberal Christians rather than Unitarians. Why? Because they charged that the self-described liberals who clung to the old patriarchal concepts of deity and excluded women from leadership roles were misrepresenting themselves. These women, and those who shared their thought, were the precursors to humanist thinking. And very few of them were allowed to serve in full-time ministries. The ones who did were vulnerable, isolated, and lonely. Cynthia Grant Tucker put it this way: however unorthodox in their theology and committed to other reforms, the liberal religionists were, as a rule, quite reluctant to alter the sex's assigned roles, and this was especially true when it came to ministry. The number of women who had the interest and nerve to take on the opposition and prove themselves in pastorates was a minuscule cluster that seemed like a great gathering only to the women themselves when their hopes got the better of them. When their hopes got the better of them. Isn't that lovely? Despite the lack of encouragement, in the 1880s and 90s, 20 or so extraordinary women claimed their role as ordained minister and banded together to serve churches through the Great Plains. Life was hard in the Plain States. There was not much glory to be earned by bringing liberal religion to the settlers of the area. Few male scholars from the seminaries in the East were attracted to the life, or if they ventured out there, they quickly found themselves unsuited to it. But if the Plains were beyond the recognition of an Eastern religious hierarchy, they were also remote from the hierarchy's rules and control. It was a place where women were accepted for their willingness to step in and serve, for their tenacity in the face of hardship, and for their ministry. Our scholars suggest that one reason for the success of the Iowa Sisterhood was the non-academic pastoral approach these women brought to their churches. They were committed to a ministry that went well beyond once-a-week pulpit appearances, devoting themselves to raising church families all during the week, manifesting the popular metaphor of church home. In other words, unlike their brother clergy, they walk the talk. Their sermons and their worship services, Sunday school programs, and church socials all enunciated the ideas and practical needs of family and home. So did the down-to-earth architecture, utilitarian furnishings, and domestic use of interior space in the church buildings that they designed. The Sisterhood's androgynous blend of business management, sound preaching, and maternal caretaking met the distinctive demands of those who broke with the Orthodox Church in the West. Not only did frontier parishioners face the problems of poverty, sickness, and climate, but they were regarded as heretics of the worst kind by their Orthodox neighbors. Does this sound familiar? Non-Trinitarians were ostracized and persecuted. They were made the object of scorn at public revivals, and they had their businesses boycotted. Can anyone relate to this? What the settlers longed for were not academic orators, but sympathetic ministers with an optimistic faith. They wanted ministers to enfold them in right, supportive communities and lighten their everyday load. Though the women clergy were barred from attending Unitarians' Harvard, this very exclusion helped educate them as no Eastern school could have. They learned about what it meant to be a minority of outsiders on the frontier and not the established religious group in New England. They knew and addressed the need for their churches to serve as rural outposts of rationality and human worth that could offer protection, comfort, and nourishment. It was filling that need, not the law of supply and demand, that explained the enormous successes in developing strong congregational life, impressive membership growth, and financial prosperity. Jenkin Lloyd Jones was a staunch ally of the Iowa Sisterhood. He was a pioneering Unitarian minister, missionary, educator, and journalist. He expanded the ranks of Midwestern Unitarians and built up much of the structure of the Western Unitarian Conference. At the turn of the century, there was tension between the churches of the Western Unitarian Conference and the conservative New England leaders of the American Unitarian Association. The AUA, the American Unitarian Association, didn't want their missionary money to fund radical ministers and churches in the West. At the 1872 meeting of the Western Unitarian Conference, Jones proposed that it would be much better if the association dropped sending money entirely, and we were obliged to raise our missionary funds ourselves. 3 years later, he got his wish. It was a happy day for the Sisterhood when Jones took the Western Unitarian Conference helm. In his weekly Unity, Jones celebrated the efforts that the women were making in pulpits and parish service, declaring that they were the strength of the Western movement quite as much, if not more, than men. When the century came to a close, there was scarcely a liberal pulpit in Iowa and the contiguous states that had not at some time had a woman conducting its services. Any liberal brother who so much as hedged on the issue was taking the risk of putting his reputation and contract in jeopardy. Today, I want to name those women who gave so much to our free religion under physical and social conditions that are unimaginable today. As we recognize them, pay attention to the number of them who were active in the women's suffrage movement, a movement that empowered the women textile strikers to strike for equity and dignity. Let us see the faces of some of these women. Florence Buck co-pastored churches with Marion Murdoch and served as Associate Secretary of Religious Education for the American Unitarian Association. She spoke frequently in public about the value of women in society and the need for women to assume leadership roles. When she moved to California, she frequently promoted women's suffrage. Because of the crusade for suffrage, Buck and her female colleagues had tenuous and often tense relationships with those denominational headquarters in Boston. Adele Fuchs kept a rare journal of what went on among the network of women in the Western Unitarian ministry from the 1880s to the 1930s. Mary Edith Colson was financially supported in her theological education by Unitarian women who ran the Humboldt, Iowa Liberal Church and public school. In addition to serving the Unitarian Church in Ida Grove, Iowa, she worked for the National Women's Trade Union League as a union organizer. After 1914, she moved to New York City to work for the Women's Political Union and the Socialist Party Women's Committee marches. Mary Hoffendale Jenny Howe also served as associate pastor to Mary Safford in Des Moines and Sioux City, Iowa, but she came disillusioned by the sluggish response to her radical gospel and disaffected by the denomination's neglect of its women. She was a leader in the National American Women's Suffrage Association, later leaving it for Alice Paul's Congressional Union, which became the National Women's Party. She founded the Heterodoxy Club in New York City and gained literary acclaim when she published 2 best-selling books on the writer George Sand. Carolyn Julia Bartlett Crane was ordained by the First Unitarian Church in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where she served for 10 years. She was also working with the 20th Century Club, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and serving on the board of the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association. In 1891, she delivered the closing sermon at the National American Women's Suffrage Association in Washington, D.C. Mary Leggett persisted for almost 3 decades in trying to salvage ailing societies in the Midwest and New England. Ida C. Holton served churches in Algona, Des Moines, and Moline, all working for the while to recruit young girls for the future ministry. She was prominent in the Western Unitarian Conference. Her abilities as a preacher were evident in her role as a suffragette. Holton was invited to speak at the Women's National Council of the United States and at the conventions of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in Washington, D.C. in the 1890s and early 1900s. During the 1894 convention, she provided testimony before the House Judiciary Committee with Susan B. Anthony, presenting the speakers and closing the discussion. Marion E. Murdoch was ordained by Mary Stafford and Eleanor Gordon in Iowa, but she moved to Kalamazoo for health reasons. There she met her domestic companion, co-pastor, and sister suffragette Florence Buck. For 6 years, she and Buck served as co-ministers at Unity Chapel in Cleveland. Murdoch spoke at the 1894 convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Rowena Morse Mann, the last of the women to be ordained and considered part of the Frontier Sisterhood, served the Third Unitarian Church in Chicago until she was forced into early retirement by the lack of opportunity for women ministers to find pulpits. She was a director of the Chicago branch of the American Association of Unitarian Universalist University Women, American Association of University Women, the AAUW, a member of the American Psychological Association and the American Philosophy Association, and she was an honorary member of the Chicago Women's Club. Anna Jane Norris worked alone in Colorado and Nebraska and farther west, trying to plant liberal congregations on what she described as poor soil. Eventually, she turned away from parish ministry to social settlement work. Estella Elizabeth Pagdam, a graduate of both Smith College and Meadville Theological School, served a small congregation in Perry, Iowa, but eventually accepted a church in Rutherford, New Jersey, where she remained as pastor for 22 years. Margaret Titus Olmsted was ordained to the Universalist ministry in 1894 and joined with the Unitarian women in leading small churches in Iowa at the turn of the century. But she found that tending to both a church and a family was too much, so she left parish ministry. Mary Augusta Safford was the driving force behind the network of women who dominated the liberal ministry on the frontier in the late 19th century. She pastored 3 churches in 3 cities and organized 7 more, which were self-supporting so as to be independent of Eastern patronage. She also served in the leadership of the suffrage campaigns in Iowa and Florida. In retirement, she organized the Unitarian Church in Orlando, Florida, and actively served that new congregation for 17 years. Gertrude von Peltzold was the first woman ever to pastor a Unitarian church in England, but was accused of neglecting the Des Moines parish to campaign for suffrage. Lacking support, she went back to England. In 1907, Petzold was the only European woman delegate to attend the 4th International Congress of Religious Liberals in Boston. Eliza Tupper Wilkes was a strong mentor for Mary Safford. With the support of her husband, she spent 40 years in the Upper Great Plains, starting new churches that opened positions for women. Wilkes was honorary vice president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, representing South Dakota. She attended the World Congress of Representative Women in Chicago. In 1896, she spoke at a Salvation Army camp meeting in Oakland on the same platform as Susan B. Anthony. She split pulpit duties with Anna Howard Shaw and Eleanor Garden at the 1905 National Suffrage Convention in Portland, Oregon. She shared the platform with both Anthony and Shaw at the second annual Women's Conference in San Francisco and at the 1905 suffrage rally in Venice, California. She represented California at the International Women's Suffrage Conference in Budapest in 1913. Helen Grace Putnam spent her early childhood as a music teacher and editor before she decided in middle age to enter the Unitarian ministry. She joined the Western Sisterhood in their work in 1887 after graduating from Meadville. In 1890, Putnam launched her mission in Jamestown, North Dakota, and local lore has it that she played piano in the saloon in exchange for the use of an upstairs hall for Sunday services. During this period, she also organized a congregation in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, over 140 miles away. Fannie Barrier Williams was an African-American teacher, social activist, clubwoman, lecturer, and journalist who worked for social justice, civil liberties, education, and employment opportunities, especially for Black women. With Celia Woolley, she was active in the development of the Frederick Douglass Center in Chicago. She was part of the group that started the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, along with Frederick Douglass, Ida Wells Barnett, Francis Watkins Harper, and W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1893, she helped found the National League of Colored Women. In 1896, she joined other organizations to become the National Association of Colored Women. Williams also worked with the suffragette Susan B. Anthony. Helen Wilson was taken under Mary Safford's wing to be her parish assistant and right hand in suffrage work. Celia Parker Woolley was one of the Super Six, the inner circle of women ministers on the frontier. She served parishes in and around Chicago, but unwilling to compromise what she believed, she left her church work after 4 years and in 1904 forged a new ministry, a neighborhood house called Frederick Douglass Center. It promoted better race relations and served the disadvantaged. In 1906, she founded the Frederick Douglass Women's Club, one of the few interracial women's clubs in Chicago. Amelia Murdoch Wing served as parish assistant in Humboldt, Iowa, where her older sister Marion had replaced Mary Safford as minister. Her main interest was teaching small children, and she used her training to help the small Iowa communities establish kindergartens. Eleanor Elizabeth Gordon served as associate pastor to Mary Safford and led Iowa women's suffrage campaign. In 1912, she returned to full-time pastorate with the newly formed church in Orlando, Florida. And Mila Tupper Maynard helped organize new liberal congregations in the Midwest and eventually moved to Denver, where she became involved in the Christian Socialist movement led by Myron Reed. This radical redefinition of liberal religious identity led the Unitarian Settlement Office to drop her name from its list of ministers. In appreciation for Jenkins Lloyd Jones, many of churches founded by the women of the Iowa Sisterhood were named All Souls or Unity. But despite the grassroots Western successes of these women and their churches, it did not translate into wider denominational acceptance. The women were seen as an embarrassment among the clergy back in Boston. By the turn of the 20th century, society in general experienced a reassertion of male authority. Unitarianism's leaders began a concerted return to a more manly ministry in order to revitalize the denomination. The move of rural populations to the cities further undermined the sisterhood's efforts and organizations and congregations. Most of the women ministers were rushed into retirement. Others left to pursue work and peace, suffrage, and social work movements. Yet they remained vocal to the end about the rights of women and the place of the church in society. The Iowa Sisterhood was not a large movement, nor was it long-lasting. It did not radically alter the possibilities for women in Unitarian ministry. But in its time and place, it was a shining vision of women called to minister and men called to support their work. And it empowered women to claim their right to an equal place in the social, cultural, and economic life of the United States. As another Unitarian, Julia Ward Howe, observed, it was hardly surprising that fighting for suffrage felt like a sacred duty when one's religion was based on the same democratic beliefs as one's claim to the full rights of citizenship. Both the Iowa Sisterhood and the women of the Everett Mill strike let their hopes get the better of them. In that hope, they advanced the voices of women, the voices demanding pulpits, bread, and roses. Amen.
Such is our history. We know that our financial contributions to this congregation come from sacrifice and hard work. Thank you. We're so grateful for this and commit together to ensure that our funds we gather collectively do greater good for ourselves and our world than could be done without them. It is fitting that we share the plate, that our shared the plate partner this month is Child Advocates as we celebrate Mother's Day. Mothering is not easy, and some children suffer from the struggle that their mothers have. Child Advocates steps forward to help Nevada County children grow up in safe, secure, and a ready future. We hope that you will be generous in your offerings because 25% of your gift will go to them, or 100% if you prefer. The basket is passed will have a white envelope in it, and there, if you want more than 25% of your gift to go to Child Advocates and their CASA program, you can put it in the envelope. Here on the screen are the ways to give, and will the greeters please come forward? nurturing care we give each other and to our precious Mother Earth. Many, many other thanks are due to all the help put these services together. Tracy worked hard on it. She's disappointed not to be able to be with us today. Andy in the back, and Paul and Cypress, and Bob's always in the mix. George with his production crew behind the scenes. If you're on chat, hi all my chat friends, and Eileen for making that happen. Shanti for the beautiful, beautiful setting, making use of nature's bounty. So beautiful. Our greeters, Lori, Carl, Connie. Refreshments, I saw Rain back there this morning. I know they're going to be good. Be sure you go back. And the Kids Connection, Lindsay, is back there. That's always a special gift because they don't get to be here. And of course, our wonderful staff. We're so happy to have Siobhan have a new title and many, many more hours. And Toby really belongs in the other slide because what he gives to this service, it's amazing. And Aiden is up top. Lots of things coming up. The Wine Market Wonderful event this coming Saturday. So be sure, there are a lot of fingers pointing back to the table where you can get your tickets. I hope you will enjoy it. And I hope you saw the write-up about Dave Luce that was in the paper just this week about what he does. UU 101, curious what this is all about? Next week at noon, we'll have a get-together for people who want to know more. And the artist reception, Linda Sitska is going to be our artist month coming up. It's going to be quite grand. Her work is beautiful. We've seen a lot of it around here, and you may not have known it. Appropriate for this month of creativity. Go to learn more about what's coming up on our website. You're going to enjoy being there. Lots of things to learn, and we're going to be coming now into our closing song, which Toby gave us a little hint of this morning when he sang his solo. So you please rise in body and our spirit and join us in singing in 109 as we come marching, marching. closing words. May the call of creativity arise again from within. May your own creative unfolding leave you in awe. May the beauty that has blessed you lead you to create beauty for those you love and those you do not know. May the creativity that arises between us help to birth the world anew. As we carry the flame of peace and love until we meet again. Please join us for refreshments and don't miss next week. See that extra U? This service is phenomenal. There's going to be a brand new premiere of a book that Jenny has written and illustrated for us. Just phenomenal things that our congregation is doing that you're not going to want to make it. Okay, so enjoy. I'll see you in the back.